sorry, guys. I apologize for how this has unfolded thus far, and I want people to know that they can trust me and that I'll always take care of the fans and people who support me.
Another twist just hit in the Logan Paul and Coffeezilla court drama, and this whole thing is starting to look way more chaotic than people expected. New details are coming out, and a lot of viewers think Logan's side is doing everything possible to control how the public sees this case. The pressure around this lawsuit keeps getting heavier by the day. Right now, Logan's camp has been focused on one major thing: keeping his deposition away from the public eye. Over the last couple of weeks, his lawyers have reportedly been fighting hard behind the scenes to stop that footage from getting released. For anyone who doesn't know, a deposition is basically when attorneys sit someone down and question them directly about the case while everything gets recorded.
They promise to stop suing him for the vastly larger amount he may owe them.
There's no room to dance around questions for too long because every answer matters. And honestly, people online already think there's a reason Logan wants this hidden so badly. A lot of speculation is going around that the questioning may not have gone smoothly for him. Some believe there were moments where he looked caught off guard or gave answers that could create even more problems later in court. And let's be real, footage like that spreading online would instantly turn into a huge talking point. Even so, many legal watchers say it's not easy to completely lock away deposition material once a case reaches this level of public attention. But despite that, Logan's team still appears determined to push for privacy as hard as possible. What's making things even more interesting is that every new update seems to bring more attention to the case instead of calming it down. The situation just keeps snowballing.
They promise to stop suing him for the vastly larger amount he may owe them. And honestly, I'm conflicted because on the one hand, victims getting money is always great. And I'm proud that our investigation led to some real-world consequences. But I can't pretend that things are fixed or fine for people who entrusted me with their story when that's just not true. So here's the real, more complicated story in 3 parts: the refund offer, the zoo tokens.
From what's been reported, Logan's side introduced 4 different arguments trying to explain why the deposition should stay sealed. But almost immediately, critics started questioning whether those reasons were actually convincing. The first argument claimed Coffeezilla could not be trusted with access to the deposition if it became public. Things got even more intense once the next argument started coming out. One of the biggest claims was that Coffeezilla could supposedly release the deposition publicly, send it to other attorneys, or even pass information over to investigators. But here's the problem with that argument. None of those things are automatically against the law in the first place. That's why a lot of people watching the case didn't think this point carried much weight at all. It sounded dramatic on paper, but legally it didn't really shake the room the way Logan's side probably hoped it would. Then came another claim saying Coffeezilla had allegedly been sharing case-related information with the FBI, and because of that, the deposition should stay sealed. At first glance, that sounds huge. But once legal analysts looked closer, the argument started falling apart pretty quickly. There are no rules stopping someone from giving legally obtained information to law enforcement if they choose to do so. That part is completely allowed. After that, Logan's team reportedly pointed toward an existing protective order, arguing that Coffeezilla was somehow violating it by discussing details connected to the lawsuit outside the courtroom. But again, critics jumped on that argument fast because the protective order apparently does not ban that type of sharing in the way they claimed. So once more, people following the case felt like the argument missed the mark completely.
I called him, I apologize. Step 2, we want to offer a rewards program for players who are disappointed in the status of the game. So essentially you're gonna be able to burn your base egg or your base animal for the mint price, which was 0.1 ETH or the equivalent in BNB. I am personally committing 1,000 ETH to this, which is about $1.3 million. I'm sorry, guys. I apologize for how this has unfolded thus far, and I want people to know that they can trust me and that I'll always take care of the fans and people who support me. And lastly, thank you, Coffeezilla. You have catalyzed this, and I am very grateful for your work and your investigation.
Then came another major accusation involving lawyers connected to the CryptoZoo class action lawsuit. Logan's side argued that sharing information with attorneys involved in related cases crossed a serious line. But Coffeezilla's legal team pushed back hard and reportedly made it clear that non-confidential discovery material can legally be shared with lawyers tied to related lawsuits. According to legal observers, that move was fully within normal legal boundaries. And honestly, when you stack all these arguments together, the situation starts looking rough for Logan's side. A lot of the points being raised simply do not seem strong enough to hold up under heavy scrutiny. Instead of creating momentum, some people think these arguments are actually making the defense appear more desperate as the case keeps moving forward. The craziest part is that several of the actions being criticized are reportedly things Coffeezilla's side is legally allowed to do anyway. That's why many people watching this unfold feel like there's a ton of courtroom drama happening, but not enough solid legal ground behind some of these complaints. Even legal commentators following the case closely have pointed out how shaky these responses appear. Right now, the back and forth is getting louder, the attention is growing bigger, and the pressure surrounding this lawsuit keeps building with every new update.
The lawsuit, starting with the most important part, and if you get one thing from this story, this should be it. These are the estimated damages in CryptoZoo, $18.5 million, which comes from a combination of ZooCoin and NFT sales. And then this, much smaller percentage of that pie, is what Logan is actually offering to refi.
Right now, a lot of people feel like Logan's side is just recycling the same arguments instead of bringing anything new into the case. To critics, it's starting to look more like a delay tactic than a strong legal strategy. The biggest fight continues to be over keeping the deposition sealed, and many believe that's because the footage may show Logan under serious pressure during questioning. But the problem is, the explanations being used to hide it still don't seem convincing to many legal watchers. At this point, the case keeps drifting into side arguments instead of focusing on the real issue tied to CryptoZoo and whether public statements connected to the project were misleading. Instead, the courtroom has been flooded with debates about discovery sharing, protective orders, and sealing documents. And honestly, all that back and forth mainly stretches the case out longer and increases legal costs for everyone involved. Every motion filed forces more responses, more prep work, and more money being spent behind the scenes. Some legal analysts have pointed out that courts see these kinds of strategies all the time, especially in high-profile lawsuits involving wealthy public figures.
I think that in Logan Paul's reply, his lawyers did some things that can potentially backfire. And explaining this really starts with the weakness of his arguments. Let me put it this way. There's this old trial lawyer's saying that if you're weak on the facts but strong on the law, pound the law. If you're weak on the law but strong on the facts, pound the facts. And if you're weak on both, pound the table. Pounding the table is often thought of as being like forceful or aggressive in your tactics, but I actually like to think of it as any strategy to try to...
That's why people are paying close attention to how aggressively the deposition is being kept private. There's also a lot of discussion online about how unusual it can look when someone fights this hard to stop a deposition from becoming public. To some observers, it raises even more curiosity about what was actually said during questioning. And the reality is, getting records sealed in a civil lawsuit is not easy. Courts usually require very strong evidence showing the information is highly sensitive, like private medical details or confidential financial records. It takes much more than simply wanting something hidden from public view. Even when courts deal with sensitive information, they usually do not seal entire documents. Most of the time, only small sections get hidden, like private names, financial details, or medical information. That's why many people think Logan's request is a tough sell. If his team wants the deposition sealed, they reportedly have to explain exactly which parts should stay private and give clear legal reasons for each section. Courts normally want detailed proof, not broad claims or vague concerns. And according to legal analysts, that's where the current arguments start looking weak. A lot of critics believe the reasoning sounds more like concern over public image than actual confidential information protected by law. But in civil court, transparency is usually the default. Court records are generally expected to stay public unless there's a serious reason to hide them.
However, although we can't be sure from this vantage point that you and I are sitting in, the judge obviously was there for the hearing, and he most likely remembers why he was concerned and what he said and how he felt at the end of this hearing. And in my experience, judges don't often take too kindly when they think the one party is taking something that he or she said before and then like twisting that into something different. And that can result in a verbal lashing from the judge in response, or it can also just mean that over time, the judge starts to build this feeling of disdain or annoyance or mistrust against your side.
Things got even more interesting when Logan's side referenced a past court ruling to support their argument. But after people looked closer, many felt the case actually supported public access more than secrecy. The ruling explained that once records become part of the public court file, the legal standard for sealing them becomes much stricter. That means the court usually assumes the public should be allowed to see the records unless there's strong evidence proving real harm would come from releasing them. And according to many watching the case, that evidence still hasn't clearly been shown here. Some legal commentators even think the arguments being made are unintentionally helping the other side more than they're helping Logan's position. At this stage, the back and forth keeps dragging the case out longer, increasing legal costs and creating even more attention around the lawsuit. And honestly, a lot of people online feel this situation highlights a bigger point. Having money and a powerful legal team does not automatically mean court records should stay hidden from the public. Public court records are supposed to keep powerful people accountable, and that's a huge reason this case is getting so much attention.
Remember, judges are human too, and they develop a sense over time about the attorneys that are in front of them. Who's professional, who's honest, and who's maybe not so much. And throughout litigation, there are many decisions along the way where the judge has to use his or her discretion. And sometimes, if the judge thinks that you have a pattern of being dishonest or unfair, or that you often engage in dirty litigation tactics, that can leave a subtle impression that can make a difference later on down the line when it really matters, when the judge is making one of these discretionary decisions. And so, if I'm reading this correctly, I think that Paul's lawyers might be running the risk of creating a negative impression with the judge at the very least. And that ultimately can, of course.
A lot of legal experts believe courts have to stay transparent, especially in cases involving major public figures, large audiences, and financial controversy. The CryptoZoo situation became a public issue because many people felt misled after promises about fixes and refunds were made. That's why so many are focused on what may have been said during Logan's deposition and whether it matches his public statements. If answers given under oath don't line up with what was said online or in videos, it could create even more problems around the case. And according to legal commentators, that's part of why the push to keep the deposition private has raised so many questions. Legal Bites also pointed out another interesting issue tied to the court filings. Logan's side reportedly suggested the judge had concerns about discovery materials being shared with lawyers connected to the CryptoZoo class action case. But when people reviewed the judge's written order, many noticed those concerns were not clearly stated the way the filing made it sound. Instead, the argument seemed to rely on a small piece of a hearing transcript rather than a direct statement from the official ruling itself. That's why some legal watchers believe the filing may have exaggerated how strongly the judge viewed the situation. And once people started comparing the actual court documents, it sparked even more debate around the case online. Now the situation is being turned into something much bigger, and a lot of legal watchers think that could seriously backfire.
Hey, attorneys on both sides, give me your thoughts about this. That is signaling that this is the beginning of a discussion with both sides. And unfortunately for us, Paul does not attach more transcript here to show how that conversation went, what the attorney said on either side, or what the judge said at the end of it. So for our purposes, there's this really big question mark as to where the topic settled at the end of this hearing. Again, he's saying, how could he not use that in that case? That means he's once again acknowledging, I know I can't stop Logan Paul from using discovery.
Critics say it's starting to look like the judge's comments are being stretched to fit a narrative that was never clearly stated in court. That's risky because judges expect lawyers to quote rulings and statements accurately. If the court feels arguments are exaggerating or misrepresenting what was actually said, it can hurt credibility fast, and once credibility starts slipping, every future argument gets examined even more closely. Some observers also think the case is beginning to look less like a straightforward legal fight and more like an attempt to overwhelm the process with endless filings and technical arguments. If a judge starts viewing things that way, it can become a major problem for the overall strategy. Legal Bites pointed out something else that shifted the entire conversation. According to their analysis, the judge's concerns were not mainly focused on Coffeezilla's behavior at all. Instead, the concern appeared to be about how information from this defamation case could potentially affect the separate CryptoZoo class action lawsuit. And that changes the framing completely. Logan's side reportedly made it sound like the judge was worried about Coffeezilla sharing discovery materials, but many people reviewing the transcript felt the full context pointed somewhere else entirely. The judge seemed more focused on the fact that two separate legal cases connected to Logan are happening at the same time, and information from one case could potentially impact the other. That's why legal analysts believe the court was being cautious about fairness, not necessarily accusing anyone of wrongdoing. The court's main concern seems to be keeping everything fair between the two separate lawsuits connected to CryptoZoo. Legal analysts say the issue is whether information from this case could end up affecting people involved in the other case, and courts usually take that very seriously. A lot of attention is also being placed on Logan's past public statements about fixing the situation and helping those affected. Once those comments get pulled into a courtroom setting, people naturally start comparing what was promised publicly with how things were handled behind the scenes.
Couple videos that I did on this topic, I talked about how this is actually highly unusual to ask for an entire deposition to be marked confidential.
That's where criticism has grown. Some people online feel the public messaging sounded much bigger than what was actually delivered, especially after reports about limited payouts and agreements tied to confidentiality. That contrast has only created more questions around the controversy. Another thing getting attention is the earlier effort to move the case to San Antonio. Critics now say it looks inconsistent because concerns about information crossing between cases did not seem as important back then, when it may have helped Logan's side strategically. But now, with worries about depositions and discovery materials possibly being used elsewhere, the argument suddenly feels very different. And according to many following the case, that shift has become another major talking point in the ongoing legal battle. People are paying attention because the rules about sharing legal information do not suddenly change depending on who benefits from it. That's why this whole situation has become such a major talking point online. A lot of legal watchers feel both sides are playing this strategically. One side appears focused on sticking closely to legal procedure, while the other keeps trying different arguments to regain control of the narrative surrounding the case. According to legal analysts, this is also why the judge brought up concerns about discovery in the first place. Coffeezilla reportedly argued that the lawsuit may have been used not only to fight defamation claims, but also to potentially gain access to information connected to the separate CryptoZoo class action case. And that's where the fairness concerns start coming in.
Over there after he gets it over here. And so what we can piece together is that the judge here isn't saying, hey, Coffeezilla, you're not allowed to share information with the class plaintiffs at all. And to be clear, that is actually what Logan Paul is trying to suggest in this current argument over his deposition. But rather, what it sounds like the judge is actually saying here is, I'm worried about all of this just turning into a huge mess where both sides start to abuse the discovery process across the board to get an unfair one-up on each other.
Critics say one side could potentially gain access to testimony, documents, and legal strategy through this case, while people tied to the other lawsuit would not have the same level of access in return. Courts usually try to avoid situations where the legal process creates that kind of imbalance. That's why many observers believe the judge's focus was less about whether information was shared at all, and more about making sure the system is not used in a way that unfairly benefits one side over another. And when people step back and look at the full picture, it's easy to see why this legal battle keeps drawing so much attention. This situation has turned into way more than just one motion or one courtroom argument. Every update, every filing, and every response is getting heavily watched because people are trying to figure out the bigger strategy behind everything happening in this case. The longer this legal fight continues, the more it feels like attention keeps shifting away from the main controversy and into endless side battles that don't fully answer the core questions people actually care about. That's why so many are locked into every new development. While all the legal back and forth keeps happening, the biggest issues tied to CryptoZoo are still hanging over the case waiting for real answers. And the more time passes, the more pressure builds. People online are comparing timelines, revisiting public statements, analyzing apology videos, and looking closely at court filings trying to connect all the dots behind the scenes. At this point, every new update adds another layer of scrutiny around the entire situation. One thing that especially caught attention was the transcript argument. A lot of critics noticed that Logan's side only highlighted a very small portion of the hearing transcript instead of showing the full exchange.
Essentially distract from the fact that there really isn't much to your case or your position in this particular argument. But the thing is, depending on your strategy here, you could find yourself in the danger zone with the judge. And I think that is where we just might be in this particular issue. To start, Logan Paul's reply is an opportunity to strengthen the arguments from his original motion. It's supposed to be pretty limited in that it's supposed to be responding to the opposition, but nevertheless, it should be able to use something to kind of bolster it somewhat. But instead of doing that, he basically repeats all of the arguments from his original motion.
People didn't get to see the complete discussion, the lawyer's responses, or everything the judge said before and after those comments. That immediately raised questions for many legal watchers because context matters a lot in court. Some observers believe that if the judge had fully supported those concerns or made a strong accusation, it likely would have appeared much more directly inside the official written order that came after the hearing. Instead, many people reviewing the filings feel like only a narrow piece of the conversation was presented, and that's become another major talking point surrounding the case. Honestly, this whole situation is starting to look more complicated the longer it goes on. A lot of people online feel like using only a tiny piece of a transcript without showing the full conversation can easily create the wrong impression. And in court, that kind of move can become risky fast if the full context tells a different story. That's why many legal watchers think this battle over the deposition is becoming one of the biggest parts of the case itself. The harder the push to keep it hidden gets, the more curiosity it creates around what may actually be inside that testimony. And naturally, people are going to start asking questions when there's this much effort being made to keep something out of public view. At the same time, others argue that legal teams always try to protect information they believe could be unfairly used or taken out of context. So depending on how you look at it, there are definitely different ways people can interpret what's happening here. Personally, it feels like this case has moved far beyond just internet drama at this point. There are serious legal questions, public accountability issues, and a lot of attention surrounding how everything is being handled behind the scenes. But what do you think about the whole situation? Do you think the fight to seal the deposition is justified, or does it make the situation look even more suspicious? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any future updates on this story.